I'm going to talk about working with students who have disabilities. My major at university was actually
My
major at the
I think he's picking somebody else up from another class.
Okay.
There's probably a crowd nearby.
I can't. Okay. All right, guys. So my major actually was elementary and special education. Actually, I've taught elementary and high school special education too. And I just finished my master's degree in autism spectrum disorder as well. So I actually have quite a lot of experience with this subject too. So today I will talk about working with students with disabilities. All right, so first one to talk about is autism, okay? So I have a question. How many of you guys at Happy, I don't know how, at Happy, when we have EV, the kids, our supervisors tell us that the kids you write the names of the students down on the board and what disabilities they have. Do they do that at Wenchung or Zhongli? Yeah. Okay, so in that case, you guys will already know in advance that the student has what kind of disability is coming. And now, so, autism. Okay, so when it comes to autism, there is a very wide spectrum of autism that falls under the umbrella. So, a child with autism can have such extreme sensitivity that a very mild stimulant can elicit a very, very negative reaction. Okay. Or it could be not so bad where let me give a better example. If you take a hot stove, there are some kids who are so sensitive that if you just put your hand over it, they are going to scream and yell, and they're going to have a very bad experience with that, as anybody would. However, there are times where if you turn the stove on, there are kids who are not so sensitive that the stove can be on and they are not really going to have any reaction whatsoever. So, now, autism, I can speak from experience between how it's handled in the US versus how it's handled in Taiwan. I have a question first. Raise your hand if you guys ever taught in the countries you guys come from before you came to Taiwan. All right, so now hands up if you're American. All right, so we all know that students with disabilities the disabilities are handled differently in the US than they are in Taiwan. Would we agree with that? Yes. So, it is my personal observation that Americans in general, I can only speak from the perspective of an American here, is that we do have a better understanding of how to actually deal with students with autism than Taiwanese teachers do. Now, I will say this though, I did live in China before I came here, and Taiwanese in general understanding of students with disabilities is light years ahead of mainland China's. Yeah, on a side note, yes, Don?
Is there a difference between autism in America and autism here?
No, there's
It's
really
exactly the same way.
Yeah, I would say they are.
Okay.
So, one of the things that you need to do for students with autism is you cannot be as stimulating as you would normally be. So, for our scenario rooms, that might be a bit difficult because in say rooms like the airport, there is quite a lot that is distracting, right? So, we need to do our best to minimize these kind of things to work with students with autism. You definitely, another thing, need to be aware of how loud you are. Now, Happy colleagues, would you agree that I am a very loud, boisterous, over-the-top person?
Not you.
Yes.
Not you, Ari.
So, if I'm saying that you guys need to be aware of how loud and how boisterous you are and how stimulating you are, you definitely need to be aware of it. For example, as our supervisor, Daisy, can tell you, when I would go into my classroom and I would say, here are the rules, and when I say I want you guys to be quiet, I would say, when I say be, you say quiet, then I would go, and then I would go, be! Now, if we had students with autism, I would not do that, because that is too loud. They will have a some of them might have a sensory reaction that could trigger them. So, now, it's because in many cases, they are particularly sensitive to noise. So if you will ever if many people who have family members who have autism can probably attest to this, if you take them to a loud place, such as a shopping mall, or I don't know where else could be considered loud. Baseball game, a sporting event, or a theatrical performance, there's a lot of noise there, right? So that could actually cause them to have a sensory shutdown too. So again, when they are in your classroom, make sure you're aware of how loud you're being and just how stimulating the lesson is. With EB, it's a little bit hard because we don't actually know what their trigger is going to be because we don't actually know the kids. However, that could also be helpful advice for after the contract ends and we're all in a regular classroom anyway. Any questions so far?
Yeah, Ari, quick question. I'm writing everything down because it's really helpful. When they asked us for suggestions as far as what we should talk about today, I asked that we needed this because I feel like I need this kind of training. Some of these, the reasons I kind of teach like you with the noises, with the stimulation. Some of the times we do that because we depend on that for attention because we need them to keep them engaged.
Yes.
So how do you balance when you have the type of class that only responds to stimulation and noise with an autistic or two kid? How do you do? I can't do that.
That is a good question. The reality is, as long as that also becomes incredibly difficult too, because again, we're not going to know that until like right before we have them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would just suggest what you do would you keep it as interesting as you possibly can, but take out as much of the
Sensory stuff.
yeah, as much of the sensory stuff as you can, but not so much that it's going to make everybody else who's a neurotypical student, that they're going to be bored.
Yeah.
So that's where the process of differentiation comes in, is you have to at least find out what it is you do on a normal routine that is potentially overstimulating. Because when I do EV, I have a very set way that I do it. I do that way for pretty much the whole time. However, when I have discovered that there are kids with autism or some other disability coming in, then what I have done is I've gone over in my head, as well as the lesson plan, to find out where it is that these overstimulating things can happen, and have tried to at least minimize those as best as I can. Because in ED, we still have to keep it as interesting as possible and make it as fun as possible for everybody, for all learners.
Especially when the language is so low, and that's all they understand.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So, another important thing to do is to keep tasks in specific and sequential order. Suppose you have so one thing that could be helpful here is you will list the tasks that you have to perform on a whiteboard where the kids can see these things. So, as a former special education teacher in my own classroom, what I used to do was I would write the stuff that I was going to do for the entire day down on the whiteboard in my classroom. So that is obviously not practical here, so what we can do here for EV and for possibly even our regular English classes would be to write the tasks down on the boards that we already have in our possession. So that would also, and then you go over those tasks with the kids themselves. So when you start the lesson, you can say something like, we're going to start off with doing this, then we're going to move on to this, and then we're going to finish up with whatever whatever it is you plan to finish up with. For example, the airport is an easy one to come up with that one for. So, the airport, you can say, oh, we are going to practice check-in. Next thing we are going to do is practice going through security. Following that, we are going to practice going through getting on the airplane and ordering our meal service. Okay? Alright. Language has to be simple and concrete. That goes without saying for the kids we have in general, right? So, because when it comes to things like, you have to make sure there's no room for any of these kids to ever misinterpret what you're saying. Especially if you ever have them in a regular classroom. Because the reason for that is idioms such as put on your thinking caps or open your ears or zip your lips, oftentimes people with autism will take that literally. And me too, yes, okay? So, these are kind of things that you need to make, we all use these phrases, right? When we want to say be quiet or when we want to say pay attention. But with kids with autism or with many other learning disabilities, you can't do it because they cannot differentiate between sarcasm and regular speaking, okay? So, also give very clear choices about what you want to do. Suppose that if a kid comes in and the kid is in a non-cooperative move, you can say to them, here are your two choices, one of which they could potentially like, and the other one is, you're going to go sit with your homeroom teacher, which they're probably not going to like very much, right? So, that's one thing that you can do for kids who have a disability. Or who are simply not cooperating with the actual lesson at hand. Anything else? Okay, another thing is to provide extremely clear structure, which I already said. I have this video, if it's okay to show it. Easy. How to handle an autism tantrum.
So how do we
Because you never know
handle
when they have to handle
a
these
child
things.
with autism having a tantrum? And I think the way to look at it is, how do we handle a tantrum firstly? You know, some of those techniques of ignoring, for example, or holding, or actually the most important is getting down to why this child is having a tantrum, for example. And I think with children with autism, because they have social and language communication issues, they are more easily frustrated, and that's a huge piece of the reason why they're having a tantrum, or a possible reason. So, preempting it, or getting to understand what's causing the tantrum. Is it a valid communication issue? Is there discomfort? Is it when a child who wants sameness and you're changing their behavior in a way that they don't want changed? They want to stay with the activity, for example. Or is it just being oppositional, which is what a lot of kids do, you know, they want what they want. And how do we work with redirecting them? Well, as I said, get to what is bothering your child, and then there are strategies based on that you can possibly, for example, redirecting them, having a timer, and giving them transition time, helping them sensory regulate. A lot of times kids having tantrums just need to be held tightly, and some kids need to be ignored.
We're not doing that though.
Let them have their meltdown as long as they're not hurting themselves. That's the typical way that parents are told about tantrums, that's just really considered bad behavior. But with kids with autism, I would be a little bit more sensitive to the fact that these children have communication issues, and a lot of their tantrums comes from frustration, and not just a matter of being oppositional. Sometimes a tantrum could be pain, and they're having reflux, and something is hurting them, and we can, misunderstand that as a tantrum. So look as to, it's a matter of analyzing each behavior, seeing what caused it, what made it go away, and that will help you prepare for next time, preventing that happening possibly. Some kids get soothed by rocking and holding, and you have to know your child individually to see what works with that tantrum. Because a tantrum I hear is like a cry for help or frustration. It is a communication, and we need to understand that communication. It is uncomfortable. You want to make sure the child is safe and people around are safe. Children often having tantrums not only can throw themselves on the floor, start self-mutilating and hurting themselves, or throwing chairs and toys, or hurting other siblings, for example. And I think that's where limit setting is important, holding the child so that he is safe or she is safe, and being very clear and structured so you can help the child calm themselves down and self-regulate and actually deal with what the issue is. And if it's a tantrum about wanting more of that ice cream, for example, or something that the child wants, well, you deal with your regular child and you sort of have to deal with some of the frustration that's part of life. But as long as you're not missing out on some core discomfort or frustration, that can really be addressed and the tantrums can hence be minimized.
That actually brings up another good point that I think about. One thing that could be helpful is to ask their homeroom teachers real quickly if there's anything that specifically can trigger these kids, because that way you can also avoid the potential trigger. I remember very well my first year of teaching, I once had a student who was autistic to the point where he could only communicate using an IT device, which meant that he could not talk at all. And as what she just said was, in many cases, autistic people, especially autistic children, are nonverbal. So you're not going to be able to talk to them to find out what is setting them off, because they can't communicate that verbally. And if they are having a tantrum that way, then they're not going to be able to use their IT, their assistive technology device either. But what we can do as EV teachers, and for wherever we decide to go after the EV program ends, is we can just give them very clear choices about what they have to do. You want this thing? You want this reward? Here's what you need to do first. If you do not finish that, then you're not getting the reward. That's something you can do that. In our case, one thing that can be a little bit more difficult is the only thing we can really reward them with is stamps, right? So you say to them, okay, you want this many stamps, then you have to complete this task. But you have to say it as simply as possible too. All right, now, so that's autism. Any questions about autism in general? Nope. All right. Now we're moving on to ADHD. Now, we've all been here, I'm sure. We all had these students who just, no matter how hard you try, they're not focusing and they're starting to drive you crazy. Anybody ever had those? That should be all of us, right? So, now, students with ADHD will obviously exhibit a tendency to be inattentive, hyperactive, and very impulsive as well. My first year, again, the first job I had a student who was ADHD to the point where you needed medication or you could not do anything with him at all. So now, thankfully, not everybody is that severe. So one of the things that's important to do for students with ADHD, and this could also apply to students with autism too, is to create an area that is quiet. You don't want to have them have as many, this area should have fewer distractions than there would be in a normal classroom, which can also be very difficult because a classroom is supposed to have things that are very decorative and are going to attract people's attention, right? So, in EV, again, it depends on the scenario, right? If you're in the airport, again, going back to that one is going to be hard to differentiate for students with ADHD because the airport has so many things in it that could easily distract them. As for other things such as, I did the drama room recently. I think that one might have been easier for students with ADHD because there weren't as many things in the drama room. Another important thing is if you find out that a student has ADHD, sitting them next to a door or a window, not a good idea, because that's going to distract them even more. Because because people come in the door and they go out all the time. As we all know, right? When we're coming in and people are photographing us. People are coming in every period. And as for the windows, they're looking outside, they're seeing what's going on out there. So do not do that. All right. Now, sitting in rows usually works. Again, this will be better for when we have a regular classroom, because there are not as many distractions as there would be if you were working in a group. So, another important thing to do is, again, like for autism, write your activities down on your board. That way the kids know what to expect is going to happen throughout the day, and what it is they need to do to achieve the goal that they want to achieve by the end of the day. Keep instructions simple, clear, and structured. Again, that goes without saying for EV and for having our regular English classes, right? Because provide visuals as much as possible. And actually, thank you, Leo, for giving us these now, okay? Because visuals are going to be most helpful to everybody. For example, if I'm going to pick this one out and say, I don't even know what this is, but sushi, okay. So, all right. So if I'm going to ask you guys to say, if I'm going to ask you, what is sushi? Do you like sushi? But if you guys don't understand what I'm saying, then it might help to have something like this. Even though that doesn't look entirely like sushi. Let's try something else. Here's another one, okay? Easier one, especially since this is not something that I have found that Taiwanese are generally familiar with, is, you would say, raise your hand if you like to watch ballet. Okay, we know what that is, but it's not something that I have found that Taiwanese are particularly familiar with. So, using visuals, such as this, will give them a better example of what something looks like, and what you expect them to do. Just don't do this in the classroom, obviously. So instructions should be given one at a time, and you must repeat them clearly, too. Okay. Apparently I've lost this. No, okay. So an example of a simple instruction. If I were to say, I love blue, and to tell you guys to color this thing in using the color blue, it's very simple, right? However, at this point, a person's ADHD is going to go, what am I expected to do with this? Because coloring something that's tie-dye is obviously very difficult for anybody who doesn't have ADHD, but because of the explosion of color in here, they're going to get very distracted and they're going to think, and their brain is going to go on the fritz, basically. Okay? So, make sure to keep everything for a kid with ADHD as simple and clear as you possibly can. Which brings us to Tourette syndrome. First of all, any questions about ADHD? Okay. Tourette syndrome. Honestly, in the entire time I've been doing this, I have encountered a kid with Tourette's one time. It's not very common. So, but when it does occur, it can be a little bit obnoxious. But there's really nothing you can do about it. Tourette's syndrome, it estimates that at least in the US, it affects about 138,000 children. So out of a population of 330 million, the chances are you're not going to come across it very often. So, Tourette syndrome consists of a tic. It's involuntary, and it waxes and wanes with lots of unpredictability. Because it's involuntary, there's really nothing you can do about it. However, one of the best things you can do for a student with Tourette syndrome is to reduce the stress level as much as possible. Stress can cause the tic to exhibit itself even more than it otherwise normally would. And in the case of the jobs we have, the kids are coming into our room, they've never seen us before, they're never going to see us again, and we're speaking to them in a language that they don't use on a daily basis. So, that can be a very stressful situation, right? So, best thing to do is to at least do what you can to reduce the stress level as much as possible. And that's it. Okay, that did not quite go 40 minutes. Oh, I sinned. Any questions about working with kids with learning disabilities at all? Now, yes, Luke.
What sort of tic did the child have with Tourette's? Was it very
She made a noise.
Made a noise.
Yeah, she didn't swear like there's like a stereotypically person with Tourette's did.
So I've been here about 2 years, 4 months, and I've taught maybe 4 or 5 kids with Tourette's. Maybe they just like slap the desk. But they try to hide it a lot of the time.
Yeah.
It's them or making noise for sure, or
Yeah.
like twitch or something.
I think the stereotype that people have of people with Tourette's is that they're going to
Swear,
swear a lot. But that could be a symbol. Well, I'm speaking from my personal experience.
Right.
But with the student that I had who had Tourette's, she made a sound that I don't think it's appropriate for me to repeat right now because I kind of felt like I was making fun of her. But if the situation was more stressful, the tic she would have would become much more pronounced than in a normal situation. Snake.
Oh, yeah, the kids with Tourette syndrome like to sing a lot.
No. And
Just asking, just checking.
so, again,
He has Tourette's.
huh?
He only exhibits syndrome, like when he's talking. But he's not talking then.
It's fine.
There's no tics. But if he
Yeah.
talks, he will go like this all the time.
Well, it could be nerves too. A lot of
No, he said it's Tourette's.
Oh, well, he probably has Tourette's, but it could be but there's probably some sort of sensory issue that's setting that off too.
Yeah.
So, at the end of the day, with kids with autism, just try to not be as overstimulating as you ordinarily would be. Again, for my colleagues who I share an office with, that they know that I'm a very boisterous person who's very overstimulating himself. With ADHD, again, keep everything simple and clear. Yes, Leo?
How do you detect a child that has autism?
Well, that has to be diagnosed by a licensed professional.
But like in the classroom, you know that the child is kind of
Because I have been doing it for a while, I can spot the kids from a mile away. With some of them, it might not be so easy because, like, I think one of the other issues you asked me to discuss was Asperger's syndrome, which is a very high-functioning form of autism to the point where you're probably not even going to guess that that person who has it is actually autistic. So, in many ways, it depends on just how severe their level of autism is.
when I was teaching, the times in primary school, but maybe in public school, now maybe it's different, but when I was teaching, there were a lot of kids who I can tell that has something wrong with them, but their parents would never tell me what, if they have a problem, or if they won't even admit it. When I tell the parents that she's acting like strange, they'll be like, it's quite normal, they won't admit to.
This is a subject that I've had to come out with extreme caution here for cultural reasons. I had students when I was in Tainan who were probably,
Autistic?
yes, if they were a day old, but because, I'm assuming because of cultural issues, their parents would not take them to as.
I don't think their parents know what autism is either. That was an issue for the parents I encountered with.
Yeah.
They didn't even know what ADHD was.
Yeah, no, again, I have to say that in comparison to places like Beijing, where I was before, where they had literally no clue what it was, I mentioned that I was a special ed teacher in the US and they asked me if they can find materials for writing IEPs on eBay. And I was like, no, you can't do that. So when I came here and found things, even the small things like handicapped parking spaces, and at least knowledge of what ADHD and autism actually are, I was like, this is kind of a breath of fresh air here. There were still some issues that I found were really interesting. Because my first job, when I went and introduced myself to the kids, the co-teacher pointed out one of the kids in front of the entire class and said the kid has autism. And I'm thinking, oh my God. Because as all Americans will know, if you do that in the States, you're asking for big legal trouble, right? In any case, that wraps up the presentation now. So,
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, let's take a 10 minutes break.